Thank you, Hiroshi. Is this on? If I could have the slides, please. So in this section, we will start at the scale of new cities in China, and we will end at the scale of small villages in the Miyagi prefecture. We are now experiencing what you might think of as a period of extreme urbanization. In the 20th century, something like 90% of the population growth will take place in urban areas. Cities will account for 80% of the wealth, 60% of all energy use will be in transportation and buildings in cities. It's where most of the innovation will take place. And in fact, in China alone, something like 300 million people will move from the country to the city over the next 15 years. And we need to find better ways to create these cities. This is Bangalore. I was in Bangalore a few months ago. 15 years ago, this street was filled with bicycles. Now, and this is Bangalore on a good day when the traffic was actually moving. It's now filled with cars, mostly with one person in it. It's a very hostile place for people. Not a good environment. In fact, cars are eating our cities. Everything in red here is a parking spot in Houston, Texas. This is typical of many cities. Another trend is work is becoming mobile and distributed. In fact, at any given time, companies say that a third of their workforce is working in the office, a third working at home, and a third in third places. That makes the home and these third places as important an office as the workplace. And in fact, it's changing our cities fundamentally. Office buildings are largely dinosaurs. So we're looking at a data-driven process of design for creating what you might think of as resilient, creative cities. So we like to start with the great, high-functioning, healthy cities. Paris, of course, is a great example of that. Paris before cars evolved as a series of neighborhoods. They were about a mile across. That was the distance people can walk in about 20 minutes. And as Paris grew, these, think of them as compact urban cells. These villages merged to create the urban area. There's something fundamental about that 20 minutes. And in fact, you find that pattern in most of the great cities that evolved before the car. There's a huge amount of data that can help us understand these cities, going way beyond what urban planners, urban designers think. This is, these are snapshots of the enterprises that you find in Paris that I actually took last night. So these are the cafes in Paris, the shops, the physicians, the pharmacies. You find that you can do the same thing in Boston and Cambridge. If you look at all the squares along the Red Line, they're about a 20-minute neighborhood. We have huge amounts of data about what goes into the physical infrastructure, the movement patterns that we can begin to use to inform the design of new cities. I like to think of what we're searching for as something like a jazz score, a lead sheet. I don't know how many of people here play music, but if you look at a lead sheet, it's usually a simple one-page structure that defines the tempo, the key, the repeats, the chord changes, the melody, the bass line, and in fact, it does not do a lot of things. It does not define the instrumentation, the voicings. It doesn't define the improvised solos. This is, could you turn that up a little bit? So this is simple reading of what's literally on the lead sheet. In fact, the musician's good enough he can't quite avoid improvising. But it's laying out the basic structure. But when you get great musicians who take that as a starting point, like John Coltrane, they can do marvelous things. In fact, I have about 20 recordings of this particular tune, Giant Steps, on my iPod. All different instrumentations, different solos, different tempos. It's quite extraordinary. So that lead sheet doesn't actually define the music. It's just it's a framework that we're searching for what you might think of as urban improvisation. So we're working on a couple of new cities in China with a consortium of Finnish companies. And we're starting with that basic 20-minute cell, what you might think of as a compact urban cell that would contain 80% of what 80% of people do in their daily lives within walking distance. It also can become a node that is a network for heating and cooling and electricity, wastewater, etc. We start then within that node to think about the streetscapes. But starting with people. So what's the experience of people? This is a small street. This happens to be Melbourne, but it could be any city. So people only. A medium street might have places for people, but integrate bikes and shared cars. But it's fundamentally a person space. This is downtown Seoul, Korea, but you find this in many cities around the world. That's a medium street. A large might include a tram, might include people and bikes and shared cars and private cars, etc. What we're very interested in, which you don't find, is what you might think of as a mobility parkway, going from one end of the town to the other without ever crossing traffic. This is Boulder, Colorado. This is Seoul, Korea, where they've removed the highway and created this marvelous space where you can walk along the length of Seoul without crossing a street. We think that within this cell you can control the density parametrically, and as you dial up the density, you dial up the number of cafes and other and shops and other uses. And there's a relationship between all of these variables which hasn't been really quantified yet. Now we think within that you add then the mobility hubs, which incidentally are also energy hubs, because if we're moving to electric vehicles, every time you have a mobility hub, you have a charging station, you need to store energy. So you have shared bicycles, you have personal electric vehicles. This is one that Ryan will talk about in a minute that we're working on. You have electric scooters that might fold to save space. The city car, again, Ryan will talk about, which is a compact light electric vehicle for two people. And you can have a whole ecosystem of special vehicles that are optimized for whatever the local needs are. So you have these resilient urban cells that can form something like a mesh network. Each are largely autonomous with respect to functions and activities and the networks that they contain. And together they can form an urban area. When you get about 5 of these at roughly 20,000 people, you start to have a city, which can then support the galleries and the museums and the things that we think of as creating a special urban place. The way we're thinking about cities is you have this experience layer, which is really starting with people. It forms what we experience as we're walking down the street. Let's think of it as a plinth with the design, the architecture, the materials, all locally improvised. And it matters little what the architecture is. It's really starting with the experiences that people in those local areas want. And then you have the functional layers. In this case, it's the towers that pop up above that can be dialed in parametrically to get greater or lesser density. Within that, you have housing. Now, we believe that just like we have folding cars that take very little space, like Ryan will talk about, we need to have housing that occupies very little space. This is actually building on a Japanese tradition of using space for multiple purposes. But in this case, your apartment converts to a workplace, your companies come in, your employees come in to service your virtual company, converts to a guest suite, a party space, etc. All those configured according to your particular needs and values. So what we're searching for is, like Coltrane's piece, are giant steps, non-incremental improvements to the performance and the livability of cities. We think actually you can get a 10x increase in the number of peoples that are served by each vehicle in the city if you move to shared vehicles. That's extraordinary. If you combine folding and autonomy, you can get about 7 times the vehicles in the space of a conventional automobile. That's an extraordinary feat. Costs about $80,000 in Boston to build a single parking space, so that number goes down dramatically. Now, of course, if you combine shared use and folding and autonomy, you get a 70 times increase in the utilization of space devoted to parking. Quite extraordinary. If you have transformable spaces, so an 800 square foot apartment functions as if it's 1,600 square feet, you get a 2 times the utilization of space. At $1,000 a foot, it's equivalent to $800,000. So we're looking for these non-incremental leaps in how we deal with cities. This graph here on the left, whoops, excuse me. This is actual data of the energy consumed by a typical new Chinese city. This is energy consumed in use. This is mobility energy. This is embodied energy in the materials. We think we can cut that in half with these strategies we've been talking about. And at the same time, I think we can dramatically increase the livability of the city, creating walkable cities, the kind of cities that people want to experience. So we're looking for these scalable strategies that will scale up from megacities to a small little village on the coast of the Miyagi prefecture. So that's a high-level summary of what we're looking at. I'm now going to turn it over to Ryan Chin. Ryan is the senior PhD student at the Media Lab. He has a background in architecture, and he is a specialist in smart customization and new mobility systems.